explain how evidence from living species gives clues about evolution. So we can see evidence for evolution for many different areas of biology. Some of those are anatomy, molecular biology, biogeography, fossils, and direct observation. We're specifically talking about evidence from living species, so we won't cover fossils in this objective. So how does anatomy teach us about evolution? Well, so we can see different species that share similar physical traits, and that might be because that trait was present in a common ancestor. Or in the example of molecular biology, different species might also share traits, but these are traits that are only seen at the molecular level. They're not physically present. So for example, a shared trait from all human species is, or all living things, is that we all have DNA within our cells. And so that's a piece of information that gives us a clue that we all came from the same ancestor at some point way back when. Biogeography. So this is talking about how organisms are distributed around the globe and how distinct features in different regions, especially islands, that's a region that can teach us a lot about evolution, display unique traits and features based on where they are. And then finally, direct observation. You can actually observe evolution happening in real time, just about with species with short life cycles and large populations, such as bacteria or some species of insects. So we will talk about a few examples of each of these. And I'll just want to point out here, this image is a phylogenetic tree. And phylogenetic trees are basically what they sound like, is a tree showing how descendants or different species descend from a common ancestor. So these are the branches of the tree and they go back to a root. So these phylogenetic trees can be built using features like physical features like body shape or color or behavior even, or they can be built using molecular or biochemical features as well. And when these phylogenetic trees are constructed, the species are organized into these nested groups based on similar traits that they share and how they're derived from the common ancestor. Okay, so let's talk about these pieces of biology that can teach us and give us clues about evolution. So first is anatomy. So the first example of anatomy that can give evidence for evolution is something called homologous structures. So when two or more different species share similar physical features, even though they might be like vastly different species, that's often because they derived from the same common ancestor. So these homologous features, this is an example of a homologous structure that's present in multiple species that were derived from a common ancestor at some point. So humans, dogs, birds, and whales, vastly different on the outside, but when you look at the structure of their forelimbs, so this is what's inside of like the big fin of a whale and a bird's wing, dog's front limb, human's arm, you can see the bone structure of these different limbs is actually has a pretty similar pattern. And it's less likely that these structures that show such similarity would have evolved independently on their own from 4 different separate ancestors, and it's more likely that these 4 species eventually can be traced back to a common ancestor that had the same basic structure of bones. And then another example of anatomy that we can look to that provides evidence for evolution is vestigial structures. So these are similar to homologous structures, but these are structures that seem to have lost their original ancestral function. So these organisms have these structures that seem homologous to structures in other species and other organisms, but they're not functional in that species anymore. So an example of one of these is, again, looking at like humans and whales. Whales have a vestigial hind leg bone. So they don't have legs anymore, but this vestigial structure that's not providing function anymore was due to its ancestor at some point had functional legs. And another example of that is humans, that we have a tailbone. We don't have tails anymore, but that vestigial structure of our tailbone provides evidence that an ancestor at some point of ours had a tail. So next is molecular biology. So how can we look at clues from molecular biology to see evidence of evolution? So I mentioned before DNA. So the fact that all living things contain DNA indicates that all living things have a shared ancestry. So all life came from the same initial ancestor. So when we compare DNA between species, and we can see how similar or different they are, that can show how related species are. So similar to the homologous structures on the last slide, a biological similarity between DNA sequences can reflect a shared common ancestry. So scientists will often compare the sequences of related genes found in different species, and these are called homologous genes. And this can tell us how the species might be evolutionarily related to each other. So for example, several different species have a gene that encodes for insulin. So humans have insulin, dogs have insulin, and that's because this gene that codes for the protein insulin was present in their last common ancestor. So in general, the more difference in gene sequence between homologous genes, then the more distantly related those two species are. So for instance, humans and chimpanzees both have genes for insulin, and human and chimpanzee insulin gene sequence is much more similar. They're about 98% identical than say human and chicken insulin gene sequence, and those are only about 64% similarity. So the fact that chicken gene sequence is less similar to humans than chimpanzees is to humans reflects the fact that humans and chimpanzees are more closely related than humans and chickens. And then biogeography. So this is how organisms are distributed around the globe and how they reflect unique features depending on where they're located. And this can give us clues about how they evolved. So here's an example. Camels, the original ancestors of camels originated in North America. And at some point in their evolutionary history, some of this group crossed into East Asia, and probably during the last ice age when some land bridges were present. And some of them made that cross and made it all the way to Africa, and some others traveled down to South America. And once these members of this original group reached these different places, over time, they all evolved independently and ended up looking a little different based on the particular environment where they ended up. So through natural selection, particular traits became more prevalent in these different groups. And now we have the diversity of the camel family that we do today. So llamas and different types of camels all come from the same common ancestor, but display lots of different features based on where they are in the world. And another classic example of this is Charles Darwin's observations of the finches on the Galapagos Islands, if you've ever heard of those. And then finally, one last biological clue for evolution is direct observation. So we can directly observe small-scale evolution in organisms that have short life cycles and large populations. And you can see it taking place in a relatively short time period. So a really relevant and kind of a crucial modern day example of evolution that we can observe is drug-resistant bacteria. So when antibiotics are used improperly, then resistant strains can evolve. So at the beginning, a portion of bacteria being treated by antibiotics might have had a naturally occurring gene allele that made them resistant to an antibiotic. So with antibiotic treatment, these bacteria would not have been killed off, and then they would have been had the opportunity to grow, and then more of them become present in that bacterial population, and over time they can become very common, making it harder to treat infections. So like I mentioned before, the two important factors that make it possible for bacteria to be able to evolve resistance to antibiotics is their large population size, which makes it more likely that some random individuals in the population will have random mutations that provide antibiotic resistance. And then second is their short life cycle. So bacteria and viruses can replicate and grow very, very quickly, and that allows them to display these evolutionary changes very quickly and us be able to observe them. So another example of this in viruses would be drug-resistant HIV. And another example in insects, another species that has that often have short life cycles and large populations is malaria-carrying mosquitoes that are resistant to certain pesticides.